The following audio has been reconstructed from declassified CIA documents, surviving letters, and Senate testimony from 1975. The voice you are about to hear never existed. It is a synthesis, an approximation, a ghost given temporary form. But the words are real. They were typed, signed, and mailed by a human hand, a hand that belonged to a man who did things that sound like fiction, except they aren't.
Dear Sidney, I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?
That's not a Bond villain monologue. That's not a scene from a Tarantino film. That is a United States federal agent writing to his CIA handler in 1979, reflecting on a decade of work, bragging about it, missing it. That is George Hunter White, describing his time running a government-sanctioned brothel where unwitting men were dosed with LSD so the CIA could watch them lose their minds through one-way mirrors. Welcome to Operation Midnight Climax. The program so absurd, so ethically bankrupt, so utterly bizarre, that when it was finally exposed to the American public, most people assumed it was a conspiracy theory. It wasn't. It was real. It happened in San Francisco and New York City throughout the 1950s and 1960s. It was funded by taxpayer dollars. It was approved by CIA directors. And it was operated by a man who treated the systematic psychological torture of strangers as a hobby, as entertainment, as fun. Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to reconstruct what happened in those safe houses. We're going to meet the people who built this machine, the people who operated it, and the people who were fed into it. We're going to read the letters that survived the CIA's document destruction. And we're going to try to understand how a democratic republic convinced itself that running a brothel full of acid was a matter of national security. To understand Operation Midnight Climax, you have to understand the fever dream of the early Cold War. It's 1953. The Soviet Union has the bomb. Klaus Fuchs has confessed to spying. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg have been executed. The Korean War has ended in stalemate, with American POWs emerging from communist camps having apparently been converted. They praised their captors. They denounced capitalism. They seemed genuinely convinced. The CIA, barely 6 years old, is convinced that the Russians have developed techniques for mind control, brainwashing. The Manchurian Candidate, except they think it's real. They think Soviet scientists have cracked the code of human consciousness, that they can program assassins, extract secrets, turn loyal Americans into traitors with drugs and hypnosis. And here's the thing. They weren't entirely wrong. The Soviets were experimenting. The KGB had its own programs. The race was real. But in typical Cold War fashion, The American response wasn't just to compete. It was to leap into the abyss, to go further, faster, with fewer constraints, convinced that the only way to save democracy was to abandon its principles.
Democracy and freedom are crossed out. National security is what matters now.
Enter Sidney Gottlieb. Born Sidney Scheider in 1918, the son of Jewish immigrants, educated at Caltech and Cornell, a club-footed chemist who spoke several languages and practiced folk dancing in his spare time. He looked like a caricature of the mad scientist. Thick glasses, awkward gait, intense stare. In 1951, he joined the CIA's Technical Services Division. By 1953, he was running MKULTRA, the agency's umbrella program for mind control research. MKULTRA is famous now. It involved 149 subprojects, 80 institutions, hospitals, prisons, pharmaceutical companies, universities. The CIA dosed their own employees without consent. They dosed soldiers. They dosed mental patients who couldn't consent. They funded research into sensory deprivation, electroshock, hypnosis, parapsychology, literally anything that might give them an edge in the war for the mind. But today we're not talking about the broad strokes of MKUltra. We're talking about Subproject 3 and Subproject 8. The ones that didn't happen in laboratories. The ones that happened in apartments, in brothels, in the dark. The logic, as explained in now declassified memos, was this. If the CIA wanted to test drugs that lowered inhibitions and loosened tongues, what better setting than a bedroom? Men would be relaxed. They would be vulnerable. They would be unlikely to report strange symptoms to authorities because, well, they'd just visited a prostitute. The perfect cover. The perfect crime. In 1954, Gottlieb approached the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He needed an agent who could operate in the field, who had experience with drug trafficking, who could navigate the underworld without attracting attention, someone with flexible ethics, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions, someone who might actually enjoy the work. They gave him George Hunter White. George Hunter White was, by every account, a piece of work. Born in 1908, he had bounced around various law enforcement jobs before landing with the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1934. He was, by the standards of his era, effective. He made cases. He broke up trafficking rings. He also shot people. Several people. He claimed self-defense every time, and every time he was cleared. But the pattern was noted. White drank heavily. He ate constantly. By the time he started working for the CIA, he was pushing 200 pounds. By the end of the decade, he'd hit 300. He had a face like a prize fighter who'd gone too many rounds, a voice like gravel in a blender, and a sense of humor that could curdle milk. He was also, by his own admission, a man of appetites. All of them. White had worked with the CIA before. During World War II, he had run a spy operation called Operation Midnight. Yes, the name echoes, where he dosed suspected enemy agents with THC to see if they'd talk. It was crude, unethical, and apparently a blast. White loved it. He loved the deception. He loved the power. He loved being the smartest guy in the room while everyone else was drugged into confusion. When Gottlieb approached him in 1955 about running a new, expanded program, White didn't hesitate. He didn't ask about ethics guidelines. He didn't ask about legal authorization. He asked about budget, about equipment, about how much discretion he'd have. Gottlieb told him total discretion. The CIA would provide the LSD. The FBN would provide cover. White would have an apartment, a stipend for operational expenses, and access to prostitutes through Vice Squad connections. His job was simple. Dose men without their knowledge, observe their reactions, and report back. The goal was to see if LSD could be used as a truth serum, as a way to break down resistance, as a tool for interrogation. But George Hunter White had his own goals. He was about to build the ultimate man cave, and the American taxpayer was going to fund it. Let's go to San Francisco, 1955. The city is in transition. The Beats have discovered North Beach. City Lights bookstore opened 3 years ago. Ginsberg's Howl is about to be published. The jazz clubs are hopping. The port brings in sailors, merchants, travelers from Asia. It's a port city, a frontier city, a place where people come to reinvent themselves or disappear entirely. At 225 Chestnut Street, in the Telegraph Hill neighborhood, George Hunter White found his perfect location. A ground floor apartment in an Art Deco building, respectable from the outside, private from the inside. The neighbors were middle-class professionals, unlikely to ask questions. The view was nice. The rent was paid by the CIA. White decorated it himself. Heavy velvet curtains, not for atmosphere, but to block any view from outside. Thick carpets to muffle sound, a well-stocked bar, a good stereo system for jazz, and, in what would become the bedroom, a one-way mirror installed by CIA technicians, behind which was a second room, an observation room, a place to watch. The mirror looked like a painting from the bedroom side, abstract art, something modern. From the other side, it was a window into intimate moments, into fear, into madness. White hired the women through connections with the San Francisco Police Department's Vice Squad. This is important to understand. This wasn't some rogue operation. Local law enforcement knew. They provided cover. They suggested girls who were reliable, who wouldn't ask questions, who needed the money enough to ignore the weirdness. The women were told it was a federal sting operation, that the clients were suspected communists or criminals, that they were helping their country. Some of them believed it. Some of them didn't care. A few later would realize something was terribly wrong and quit. Most just did the job. They were paid well, better than street rates, and White treated them decently by the standards of the industry. He was professional. He was organized. He was, in his way, a good boss. And then there was the LSD. Sidney Gottlieb's team synthesized it or acquired it from Sandoz Laboratories in Switzerland, the original patent holder. The CIA had, in fact, bought the entire world's supply of LSD in 1953. 13 pounds. Enough for roughly 100 million doses. They were terrified the Soviets would get it first, so they hoarded it. And then they started testing it on everyone, including now unwitting American citizens visiting a government brothel.
What is that? Just a little extra kick.
The dosing was simple. The woman would offer the mark a drink. Gin and tonic was popular. The quinine helped mask any bitter taste. White in the other room would spike it, usually between 50 and 150 micrograms, enough to guarantee a trip, not necessarily enough to cause complete incapacitation. Though that varied, the CIA wasn't exactly precise. Sometimes they gave too much. Sometimes the mark had an empty stomach. Sometimes the chemistry just went wrong. Then White would watch and take notes. And sometimes, if he was in the mood, he'd dose himself too. Because George Hunter White believed in participatory research. Or he just liked getting high on government acid. It's hard to tell with White. The line between professional curiosity and personal indulgence seems to have been non-existent. The nights followed a pattern. The mark would arrive, nervous, excited, maybe a little drunk already. He'd pay up front, $20, big money in 1955. The woman would make small talk, pour the drink, encourage him to finish it. Then the waiting. 20 minutes, sometimes 40. The come up. White documented everything. Subject appears relaxed. Subject reports feeling unusual. Subject becomes agitated, requests to leave. Subject weeps uncontrollably. Subject attempts to climb out window, restrained by female operative. These are real notes, reconstructed from surviving documents. Clinical, detached, as if they were testing car engines, not destroying human minds. And then the mark would leave. Usually confused, sometimes terrified, occasionally euphoric. No follow-up, no medical supervision. No explanation for why reality had suddenly fractured. Just out into the night. Into the San Francisco fog. Into a life that might never be the same. White called it the pad. Just the pad, like it was a crash pad, a hangout, a place to chill. He wrote about it in letters to Gottlieb with evident nostalgia. The velvet curtains, the good booze, the jazz, the power. Always the power. But here's where we need to talk about what this actually was. Because it's easy to get lost in the absurdity, the CIA brothel, the acid, the one-way mirrors, and forget that this was sustained, systematic, state-sponsored torture. Psychological torture, but torture nonetheless. Imagine it. You're a traveling salesman, maybe, or a sailor on shore leave, or a businessman in town for a conference. You're lonely. You're curious. You follow an address, a whisper, a suggestion. You pay your money. You're nervous but excited. You drink your drink. And then your hands start to feel wrong. The walls breathe. The woman's face melts slightly at the edges. You hear colors. You taste sounds. Your heart is hammering. You know something is terribly, fundamentally wrong, but you don't know what. You don't know you've been drugged. You think you're dying. You think you're going insane. You think God is punishing you. You think, and through it all, through your panic and your confusion and your primal terror, there's a fat man in the next room, drinking scotch and taking notes, watching you lose your grip on reality, getting paid for it, getting off on it. Some of these men had pre-existing mental health conditions. The CIA didn't screen. They didn't care. Some had heart conditions. LSD can cause cardiac stress. Some were on other medications that interacted badly. One man, an Army employee named Frank Olson, though he wasn't part of Midnight Climax specifically, was dosed at a CIA retreat, had a psychotic break, and 9 days later was found dead on a Manhattan sidewalk, having fallen from a hotel window. The CIA called it suicide. His family spent 50 years proving it was murder. The women, the sex workers who were the other half of this equation, were also victims. They were exposed to LSD regularly, sometimes accidentally, sometimes because White thought it would be interesting to see how they handled it while working. They were in rooms with men who were losing their minds, sometimes violently. They had to talk jumpers down from windows, calm paranoid delusions, manage sexual encounters with men who no longer understood what was real. And they did it for minimum wage plus tips, thinking they were serving their country. George Hunter White thought it was fun. Fun, fun, fun. That phrase echoes. That phrase haunts. Because it reveals the truth about Operation Midnight Climax. It wasn't just an experiment. It was entertainment. It was a show. And George Hunter White had the best seat in the House. The year is 1979. Watergate has come and gone. The Church Committee has exposed MKULTRA. The CIA has admitted, partially, reluctantly, to dosing unwitting Americans. Operation Midnight Climax is public knowledge, though most people don't believe it or don't understand the scope. George Hunter White is 71 years old. He's retired. He's living in Stinson Beach, California, a wealthy enclave north of San Francisco. He's bought a boat with his government pension. He weighs nearly 300 pounds. His liver is failing. He's bored out of his mind. And he decides to write to his old friend, his old handler. Sidney Gottlieb, who has also retired, who is living in Virginia, who has tried to put the past behind him. White writes him a series of letters, rambling, nostalgic, disturbing letters. Letters that would become the primary source for understanding what actually happened in those safe houses. Because, unlike Gottlieb, who destroyed his files, White kept souvenirs. White kept memories. White wanted to remember.
Dear Sidney, of course I was not a loose wheel or a nut, as you suggest. I was a very minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?
Read that again. Let it sink in. He's not denying it. He's not minimizing it. He's bragging about it. He's framing the systematic psychological torture of dozens, possibly hundreds of men as a religious mission. A vineyard he toiled in, and he misses it. God, how he misses it.
If I had known then what I know now, I would have been more aggressive and less careful. The business of the Rockefeller Commission and the Church Committee was a real ball breaker. I was called before the Senate, you know. They asked about the safe houses. They asked about the women. They asked about the mirrors. I told them what they wanted to hear. I protected the family.
The family. He means the CIA, the all highest. He still thinks of them as family. He still thinks of what he did as service. The Senate questioned him in 1975. He was evasive. He claimed memory loss. He protected Gottlieb, protected the program, protected the institution. And then he went home and wrote letters complaining that he hadn't been aggressive enough.
The pad was a work of art, Sidney. The mirror was perfect. You couldn't see it from the bedroom side, just looked like a painting. Abstract expressionism, very hip. I had the girls trained well. They knew how to pour, how to distract, how to keep them drinking until it hit. Some of those Johns, you should have seen their faces, Sidney, when they realized something was wrong, when the walls started moving. Priceless.
Priceless. He uses that word, or implies it. The terror of strangers was priceless to him, a form of entertainment. A show he directed and starred in and watched from behind the glass.
I kept the boat, you know, named her the Puke. Remember how those army boys used to vomit? Green as grass, heaving for hours. The Puke. I take her out on the bay. I think about the old days. I think about the power. I think about what we could have done if we'd had more time. If the hippies hadn't ruined everything with their peace and love.
The hippies. He blames the hippies. Not for exposing him, though they helped, but for ruining LSD, for making it a cultural phenomenon instead of a secret weapon, for taking his toy and turning it into a symbol of liberation. White hated the counterculture, hated that the drug he'd used to control and terrify was being used by kids to find enlightenment. It offended his sense of ownership, his sense of power.
Sometimes I dream about it, Sidney. The pad, the music, the girls, the looks on their faces. Do you dream about it? Do you remember the night we dosed the senator's aide? The one who thought he was Jesus for 6 hours? I laughed until I cried. I miss that. I miss the fun.
We don't know if Gottlieb wrote back. Probably not. Gottlieb spent his later years trying to atone, running a leper hospital in India, living simply, avoiding publicity. He knew what they'd done was wrong. He knew it was evil. White never did. White died in 1975, actually shortly after testifying. Heart attack. The coroner found evidence of long-term alcohol abuse, possible cirrhosis, and, ironically, traces of LSD in his system. Old habits indeed. He died thinking he was a patriot. He died missing the power. He died without apologizing to a single victim. And his letters sit in archives now available to anyone who wants to understand how ordinary men become monsters. Not through ideology, not through fanaticism, through fun, through the slow, seductive erosion of empathy that happens when you're given permission to do anything. When you're told that your darkest impulses serve a higher cause. George Hunter White was not a Nazi. He was not a Soviet torturer. He was an American federal agent with a government pension and a boat named the Puke. Let that be the lesson of Operation Midnight Climax. The banality of evil doesn't always look like Eichmann at a desk. Sometimes it looks like a fat man in a velvet room, drinking scotch and watching strangers scream, thinking he's saving the world. San Francisco wasn't enough. By 1960, Operation Midnight Climax had expanded to New York City. Greenwich Village, the epicenter of American bohemia, of jazz and poetry and political radicalism. Another safe house, this one above a bar called the Plaza Hotel, not the famous one, a dive. Perfect cover. Same setup, different city. White would commute between coasts, managing both operations, growing fatter and more powerful. His expense reports a litany of booze, sex, and LSD. The CIA had given him carte blanche. He was accountable to no one. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics thought he was working for the CIA. The CIA thought he was working for the FBN. In reality, he was working for himself, building an empire of voyeurism. The New York operation was more dangerous. The city was rougher. The marks were more diverse. Artists, musicians, students, political activists. The CIA was no longer just dosing businessmen and sailors. They were dosing the people who would shape the 1960s. Beats becoming hippies. Radicals becoming revolutionaries. Did they dose someone famous? We'll never know. The records were destroyed. But consider this. In 1962, a young writer named Ken Kesey volunteered for a paid drug study at Stanford University's psychology department. It wasn't Operation Midnight Climax. It was a related MKULTRA subproject. The CIA gave him LSD. Kesey later described it as the most significant experience of my life. He wrote, "One flew over the cuckoo's nest." He became the psychedelic Pied Piper of the 1960s, leading the merry pranksters, spreading LSD culture across America. The CIA wanted to control minds. Instead, they accidentally helped spark a cultural revolution. The irony is so thick you could choke on it. They were trying to build the perfect interrogation drug, the perfect truth serum. And instead, they created the sacrament of a movement that would reject everything the CIA stood for. War, authority, control. By the mid-1960s, LSD was leaking out of the labs. Timothy Leary was telling kids to turn on, tune in, drop out. The genie was out of the bottle. And George Hunter White was furious. He saw the counterculture as thieves stealing his weapon. He wrote letters complaining about long-haired freaks ruining the program. He didn't understand that you can't control a substance that dissolves ego, that breaks down boundaries, that makes people question authority. The New York safe house closed in 1965. The San Francisco operation limped on for another year. White was getting old. The culture was changing. The CIA was losing interest in LSD, partly because it clearly didn't work as a truth serum, partly because they couldn't control the supply anymore. The world had moved on. White retired in 1966. He took his memories, his letters, his boat, named the Puke, and he faded away. The apartments were cleaned. The one-way mirrors were removed. The women were paid off or disappeared into the city. Operation Midnight Climax became a footnote. A weird story, a conspiracy theory that happened to be true. 1975. The Church Committee. Senator Frank Church, Democrat from Idaho, leading a massive investigation into intelligence abuses. Watergate had opened the floodgates. The public was ready to believe that their government had been lying to them. They weren't ready for this. The MKULTRA hearings were held in August 1977. By then, most of the documents were gone. Richard Helms, CIA director from 1966 to 1973, had ordered the destruction of all MKULTRA files in 1973, when he learned that Watergate investigators were looking into CIA activities. 200 boxes of documents, financial records, medical data, the names of subjects. Gone. What survived was accidental. A cache of financial records stored in a separate building, a few letters that hadn't been filed properly. The testimony of retired agents who were willing to talk, and George Hunter White's letters to Sidney Gottlieb, written after the destruction order, too late to shred. Senator Church held up a CIA-made poison dart gun disguised as a fountain pen. He talked about assassination plots against foreign leaders. He talked about mail opening and wiretapping. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned the brothels, the LSD, the unwitting Americans. The media didn't know what to do with it. It was too weird, too sordid. The New York Times ran stories, but they were buried. The public focused on the political assassinations, the Watergate connections, the big picture. Operation Midnight Climax was filed under bizarre CIA antics and forgotten. But for the victims, for the men who were dosed, who spent decades wondering what had happened to them, who suffered psychological damage, who lost their grip on reality in a government-sponsored brothel, there was no forgetting and no justice. No one was prosecuted. Not White, he was already dead. Not Gottlieb, he claimed he was following orders. Not Helms, he claimed he was protecting national security. The statute of limitations had run out on most of the crimes. The evidence had been destroyed. The victims couldn't be identified because the records were gone. In 1992, the victims of MKULTRA reached a settlement with the CIA. They got money, some of them. Not much. Not enough. The government admitted no wrongdoing. The checks came with gag orders. Take the money and shut up. Go away. Let us forget. George Hunter White's boat, the Puke, rotted at a dock in Stinson Beach. It was eventually scrapped. The apartment at 225 Chestnut Street became luxury condos. The New York safe house became a Starbucks, probably. The one-way mirrors are in landfills. The LSD has degraded. The women are dead or old. The men, the subjects, are statistics, but the letters remain. White's voice, captured in typescript, bragging about his fun, his sanctioned rape and pillage, his vineyard. And when we read them, when we reconstruct them, give them voice, try to understand, we have to ask, what have we learned? Operation Midnight Climax was a feature. The CIA still operates black sites, still uses enhanced interrogation, still claims that national security requires secrecy, requires the suspension of ethics, requires us to trust that they know best. The names change, the drugs change, the mirrors remain. I want to leave you with an image. It's 1957. San Francisco, fog rolling in off the bay. A man, let's call him John, though we'll never know his name, stumbles out of an apartment building on Chestnut Street. He's sweating. His pupils are dilated. He doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know what happened. He knows only that reality has cracked, that something terrible has been done to him, that he will never feel safe again. He walks to the waterfront. He looks at the Golden Gate Bridge, half visible in the mist. He thinks about jumping. He thinks about going to the police. He thinks he's going insane. He does nothing. He goes home. He never speaks of it. He drinks to forget. He fails. 50 years later, his son finds him dead. Liver failure. The death certificate says natural causes. But it wasn't natural. It was Operation Midnight Climax. It was George Hunter White having fun. It was the United States government trying to save the world one acid trip at a time. We don't know John's name. We don't know how many Johns there were. We know only that they existed, that they suffered, that they were sacrificed on the altar of national security by men who thought they were patriots. Men who thought it was fun. George Hunter White called himself a heretic in the vineyards. He was wrong. He wasn't a heretic. He was the true believer. The man who never questioned. The man who enjoyed. The man who named his boat the Puke and died. The vineyard is still there. The grapes are still being pressed. And somewhere in a building you walk past every day, someone is watching through a one-way mirror, convinced that what they're doing is necessary, is patriotic, is fun. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all MKULTRA files destroyed. 20,000 documents survived. The full truth never will.